So I'm going to try my best to explain tiling textures in this one. A lot of guys getting into environment art are really struggling with this. So it's important to understand several different things because they all kind of play together. It's important to understand UV mapping, modeling, texturing, creating seamless textures. And then also this is going to work into doing like high to poly to low poly bakes. So it's important to understand the baking process and, you know, that sharp edges need seams, all that fun stuff. And then it's going to have to do with using color ID maps possibly as well in that process to set up your materials inside of something like Substance Painter. So first and foremost, I just want to do a quick little reminder here of when you're pre-planning things out. It's a part of this process, believe it or not. It's actually very important. But like say you're designing something or you're looking at reference images, it doesn't matter. A lot of times things are broken into different little parts and it's kind of the composition of whatever it is you're creating, right? And your detailed object would live inside of that composition basically, right? Somewhere. So I'm just going to do this real quick. Hopefully I don't have any major issues here when I try to fill this. It's going to be a little bit rough, but basically your primary shape, something like that, right? And then you'll have secondary shapes. So let me go get a different brush real quick. You have your secondary shapes later on, complement the primaries. Okay, and then you just look nice with it basically. So you might have like breakups that take place in certain areas, who knows? And lay out some interesting compositions of primaries, secondaries, and so on and so forth. And then you can have layering, so things might be pushed down in some areas, some things might get pushed up. You can make more secondaries in this manner as well, right? Okay, so once that's done, think about trims, right? They could be decals, but they could also just be like panel lines, whatever you really want. Trims can exist anywhere. And bring that one all the way down, I guess. But yeah, some stuff like this, perhaps. It's going to create more secondary shapes, basically. There's all kinds of ways of breaking up your models, making them look really cool. And it can also help with the texturing process. And then next up, you'll have details at some point that you start adding little greebly bits, decals, perhaps, stuff like this. So the main thing that you're going to run into is as you're creating models for games, I don't care if it's a vehicle or if they're large pieces of environments, you're going to probably run out of texture memory or VRAM because you're using too many textures. And so that's something that's more than likely going to happen. So planning out your assets, thinking about what kind of materials you need, material slots, should I say, because, you know, this can have multiple materials in it potentially. These details can be made of all kinds of different things. Like maybe you have a hose that for whatever reason is plugged into the front here. Has some kind of like little support bracket and this hose runs out the front, right? But then it drips down and it plugs in somewhere down here or something, right? Maybe a couple of them come out or something. Right, now try texturing that on a 0 to 1 UV space, and depending on the size of this object, you can run into a lot of problems. You know, if this is a really small object, and you have a big person next to it, right? A lot of you guys that make props already know about this, but you just put this on one texture sheet. It's not really a big deal. You can pack it all on there, maybe do some UV overlapping or something, right? That's not a big deal. But what happens when this object size is much larger, right? That's when you start have to focus on using things a little bit more cleverly. So this would be maybe one material, the greens, right? This might be another trim material. And then you have maybe like a detail material, right? Possibly. Could you do this more efficient though? And that's where everything comes into play, right? It's a very elongated texture. Let's just do a square for now. Right? So this one here could possibly be a combo of detail and trim, right? So that's when you see those trim sheets laid out and they have little baked high to low poly models underneath it. All right. And this could be a decal. It could be just on, pure geometry. Like if we cut all that out, but it could be decals laid out everywhere mixed with high to low bakes on this stuff perhaps, but wouldn't necessarily work out well because those would be alpha materials. Maybe you don't need alpha materials on this. You might keep them separated in that case, but something like that could happen. And also this material here could be like 3 materials or more maybe, where you're doing material blending as well. So it could be an additional 3 of these all blended together using things like vertex colors or a black and white image mask to go ahead and make this all show up appropriately in the right areas. And so that way you can have materials change around here or there. Combo this up with the last one, which we didn't really create, which could be decals. This could be like infographic decals or grunge decals or like rusts or stains or scratched metal logos, whatever you really want. You can do all kinds of fun stuff. You can make all your decals here, right? And lay them out all over the model. You can do this for maybe like little nuts and bolts or whatever you want if you're doing more of like a mid-poly workflow, right? And so this is where that can happen. And so you just have tons of fun with decals, little surface details, basically. All right. So all in all, you could end up with like 4 materials, 3 materials, but if you can combine them together, so like we did this one, now we're looking at 3. If we don't use the decals at all, perhaps, and we're looking at 2, right? That's going to save us a lot of memory, perhaps, the further we go down, but then you run a risk of things become repetitious, kind of mundane and boring, and not as interesting looking, and you might not have like the amount of texture variation that you want to represent whatever object you're creating, right? So that could happen. But this is where tiling materials come into play, because one of the things we kind of skipped here is if we're doing this hose here or this wire and this thing plugs into whatever kind of crazy contraptions and we detail cram a bunch of stuff in here, you see where this is going, like right here. Details can also be trims on any given moment's notice, right? Like this is still technically kind of a detail, but you could use it as a trim. So you can really do anything you want here, right? Like if you want to do, if it's small enough, you can just do like you would do any other prop, just one texture, probably one material. But if you're doing something larger, you can start to break it up in all kinds of different interesting ways and do all kinds of different shader tricks and so on and so forth. But the key to all that is being able to create things that tile. So that wire, it's just a wire or hose or whatever it is, but you only do a section of this and you only texture that little section and you make that seamless. So in your UV map, it's somewhere in here. It's nothing more than just like a regular cylinder unwrapped for the most part, right? But it's seamless, right? So it stays seamless on the ends. How do you do that when you're doing high to low poly bakes? That's where a lot of people run into trouble. And then also because this is going to be on something like an atlas, like part trim sheet, part atlas of details, high to low poly bakes, how do we set all this up and model it and do all this kind of in batch? And that's where color IDs come into play as well, because anytime you start creating color IDs, you can change materials in Substance Painter super fast, right? It's very easy to do that. But how do we make things tile? That's the main thing, right? Tiling. It's just like creating things that are seamless for the most part. So anytime you, let's say, have a texture, okay, and I'm just going to quickly scale this image to a new size. It's very large. Actually, let's go very small with it maybe. Oh, actually, I don't know if it's going to crop it. Let's see if it crops it, actually. The background image anyways. I think it does. Yeah, it does. All right. Anyways, this will work still. It's fine. Here in Krita, you can just make it tile or make it seamless, or it's making it tile, right? So that's kind of the whole idea of it. A seamless texture can be a tile. A trim sheet can be a tile. But on an atlas, you can make things tile as well. And you can make them seamless. So in our case, Krita, we use the healing brush tool or healing brush tool, turn healing off, just right click. It's now the clone stamp brush. So we control click, pick something, and you can see here, we can just start working one edge. You only got to work 2 edges in this case. I'm going to do it very sloppily, but we can make it seamless, right? So our canvas is tiling basically, right? That's the main thing. So how does this actually work out? What am I getting at here? Well, when we go over to Blender, let's do that real quick. Let me launch this thing up. Our geometry is the canvas, okay? How it maps to the texture is going to determine whether it's a seamless texture, an atlas, or anything else. So let me just prove this point here. So if we create a plane, we go to the UV editor, this map 0 to 1, this would be like the image we were just working on, right? So our canvas is the same as the image. And so subsequently, let's just say we give this a material real quick. Go to shading, create shift A, texture, image texture. We'll create new. It's going to be a 1024. Okay. And plug it into base color. And now what we can do is tab key or control, control tab. You can do this one. Texture paint. You see our image here. Okay. We can go to texture paint for this one as well. You may want to switch it from, they changed it up to here now, didn't they? You can change it from material to possibly single image and work on that untitled image if you need to. But the main idea is that it's going to come in black because we generated the image as black. Texture over here, new. Okay, nothing changes. We have to go down here. We've created a new texture. This is the one. We can open an image perhaps. And then let's just go to like, say, this folder here where I have all these rock textures. Let's do this one for now. And I'm going to change it to be a stencil real quick, okay? So I'm going to go hold Alt while orbiting and just right-click to drag this around, shift right-click, you can make it larger, all right? It doesn't matter if I keep it seamless or nothing right now because we're about to do that, right? But the main idea is that don't do it upside down, maybe. Okay, trying to make my model correct. Where the heck did it go? Okay, it's upside down. There you go. And we'll just position it like so. We're using black right now. We want to press X, maybe use white. We can just lay that on there real quick. You see how it starts to fill it in the 0 to 1 space. Okay, great. Not a big deal. Now I wanted to show this in Blender for the texture painting. Just works well here with the UVs so we can see what's going on. I would recommend texturing in Substance Painter. It's going to work basically the same way as long as you do your geometry the way it needs to be done. In this case, it's just a plane, nothing too big. But let's go ahead and play around with this idea real quick. We're going to go actually back to texture paint let's go to object mode real quick. Z material preview. What we're going to do is turn on grid snapping real quick. And I'm going to just shift D and duplicate and hold control. So if we start laying this tile, this geometry out like this, right? We're creating a repeating tiling texture off of geometry. So our canvas is tiling now, right? Grab the last one, Control J, join them all together, okay? This is what we're going to end up getting right here. You can also try merging these by distance. Sometimes that helps, okay? So when we go back to texture paint now, and get rid of the texture, we don't want to use that. I'm going to turn my wireframes off, but we can also use like clone stamp tool at this point, right? And so if I use the clone stamp tool and I hold control and click somewhere, we can use it just like we were in Krita. You can see it's tiling, it's going to repeat, okay? That's the main thing. So tiling textures is huge. You have to understand the difference between just making it seamless and actually making it tiled. I think that's one of the big things here. So we can do this basically inside of Krita as well, right? Well, we can do this with all of our models, potentially, if we set them up correctly, as long as, well, there's certain ones that work better than others, like cylinders, for example, which we'll go over. But the main idea is that we just did this, right? So now we can save out this image and we have a seamless texture, right? You can do it in Blender. Now, this is where it gets tricky. This can still be seamless even if we didn't UV unwrap it in the 0 to 1 space, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shrink it, push it into a corner. It's going to be hard to see this a little bit maybe because of the texture, but you can see now it's not seamless anymore, right? Because it's only using this part of the UV space. And so when we go back to texture paint mode real quick, no, texture paint, and I thought I was in it. I was maybe. We can still clone stamp. We can still make this seamless, right? So our canvas isn't changing. Our UV mapping is changing. So UV mapping is just exactly what it is. It's mapping a texture to a image, right? That's what it's doing. It doesn't matter where that image really exists as long as there's nothing overlapping on it, like other UVs or anything like that. We don't have any problems, right? We can do this all day long. Even if you had overlaps, it would still paint okay. But when it comes to baking, it won't. So that's the big thing. But you can see now that we've done that, our little square here where the UV exists is going to be seamless. You see how it creates bleed on the edges here? Okay, compared to where the island is. So if we were going to edit mode real quick. Okay, so it does actually create bleed here for you inside of Blender, which is actually kind of nice. I wish Krita would do something like that too, but it doesn't, unfortunately. So, not that I'm aware of anyways. Now, here's the thing. So this is a tiling texture. Easy enough. Depending on the geo that you're working on, say like a cylinder, right? And we delete these caps. It doesn't matter where this thing is UV mapped at, right? It matters how we set up our canvas. So in our case here, shade it auto smooth. Let's add an array modifier, and we'll go up on Z once, relative, turn 1 off here, 0, and we'll do it 2 or 3 times. No, 0, not 90. Okay, and so it's repeating 3 times. If we were to go back into texture paint with this one, get out of that, create a new image, and we'll just say untitled 2 maybe. Get rid of that for a second. We have another black image now, and our texture paint tools, we can go ahead and set to use untitled 2. Okay. Texture paint it. Use a paintbrush. It should be working, but I didn't set a material up for this one. So let's do that real quick. Let's do material, base color, image texture. We'll use untitled 2. This is oftentimes why you use materials anyways, because like single image is great, but material, it would automatically kind of pick it. Unless you had multiple textures going, then you might have to pick the right one. Anyways, this isn't about texture painting in Blender. This is about the modeling and UV mapping in Blender, right? Same thing's going to happen here though, because left and right, up and down with that UV island, it's all meeting up with all the vertices. The UV map would meet up with itself. So if we were to just start painting on this one, you'd see the same effect basically occurring, because it's basically a curled up plane. It has additional edges, but it's a curled up plane basically, right? And that's the main idea. So we can actually create seamless textures this way, or tiling with the model this way. So anytime we're making anything, I don't care if it's a trim sheet or a sculpt or whatever, as long as we can create the tiling effects that we want, and we can put them onto an atlas, okay? When we bake high to low, it can be on an atlas, and it can still be tiling. And then later on, you can create other objects and reuse that texture if you needed to as well, as needed. So let's do another one real quick. Just go to a new scene for it. Create another plane. I want to show you this one as well. So we already know that this is going to be tiling. It's a 2-meter plane. Keep that in mind. We're going to need that information later on. But you can also seamlessly sculpt things, right? So when you're doing displacement maps, height maps, those kinds of things, or you're trying to combo stuff together, this is important, okay? So we grab all that, join it together, merge by distance, right-click, subdivide. You can hit Shift-R a number of times. You have to do this with destructive mesh. Dynamic topology, voxel remesher, and even multi-res won't work for this. So what you have to do is destructive mesh. You have to remember where that little center point was. So like these little grid squares in the background, these are going to be every meter. Like these are going to be 1 meter by 1 meter. So 2 meters, we're looking at the center ones, 2 meters, 2 meters. We subdivide this thing up. It's already fairly dense, but we're using a lot of extra space here that we don't necessarily need, right? So we can trim this. Don't go into the 2 meter area, but just stop just short of it, like a quarter short. And we can trim all of these down now. And our setup here is still going to be seamless if we were to start sculpting on this. So, because we're not into that 2 meter area, which is somewhere inside here. Okay, so we can actually press delete all these faces. We don't need them. We don't need to sculpt on them perhaps, right? So this here, we can subdivide. We can take it a little bit higher. You can see it's twice as dense now, and it's still below the face count that we had once before. So that's quite useful. And this gets a little bit better because we can actually create a material for this one, perhaps, bring it in an image texture. Okay. Try this again anyways. And bring in any kind of image texture that we want here. Let's find one that's a little bit more interesting, perhaps. I will just go with this one for now. Go to material preview, and you can see what's going on here. So this texture, of course, we can set it up differently where it's already seamless perhaps, and we bring it in. You can see it's a little bit stretched out right now. We could try to map it perhaps or something like that, but we'll leave it alone for now. We're just going to sculpt on it for a second. We can Control Tab, go into sculpt mode. Sculpt mode here is where the magic happens. So, we have symmetry, mirror X and Y, but there's all these other fun ones that you've never seen before or used. There's lock X and Y. So if we're creating height maps, we only want to work up and down, generally speaking, right? Unless you're trying to create like VDM brushes, then maybe you can do other things. But in this case, up and down, so X and Y. Tiling, also X and Y. We want it to tile. But when we start looking at the tiling aspect right now, it's wrong. And that's because it's using 1 by 1 meter, right? And we need to use 2 meters, okay? And so we can do all that. Now we've locked X and Y. We have tiling on X and Y, and it's at 2 meters. This is set up appropriately to seamlessly sculpt, basically. Our image isn't seamless, but we can seamlessly sculpt. Now, the trick with this is that, let's go to actual sculpt mode. Oh, we are in sculpt mode. Okay, never mind. Let's use clay strips for just a second. Now, the trick with this, though, is that you can do a lot of work in Substance Designer to create like rocks and cliffs and all that fun stuff, but you can also sculpt it. It's going to take you a while to sculpt anything worthwhile. But this is an older school technique that you could utilize to start making height maps, because a lot of times you were using approximations. So like if we were in Substance Designer, for example, let me just open that up and then we'll take a look over there. A lot of you guys probably have seen it before. There's different programs like Materialize, there's Instamat, there's Substance Designer, Bitmap to Material, Substance 3D Sampler, all that other fun stuff, right? But in Substance Designer, you used to have, at least you would have Bitmap to Material Light. I don't know if it's in the new versions. I'm still on an old version right now. So, but the main idea is you would create like your new package, you would create your new substance graph. You could use whatever you want, empty, metallic, rough, it doesn't matter in this case, but we could bring in something like an image texture from file. And then so now we can go back to the texture I was using, which was from textures.com, rocks or something like that, right? Yeah. And we could take the one that matches perhaps. This is where pre-processing it into a square is helpful. But something like this, perhaps, we're just going to link the resource for now. If we use something like Bitmap to Material Light or process this manually, we could easily plug that into Bitmap Diffuse there. And we can drag it down here and preview it. You can see it generates kind of a normal map, height map, very fast using. So this is considered approximation, basically, when creating a height map / PBR material, right? It's just figuring things out the best it can from the image, basically. All right. But the fun thing about it is that it is generating a height map here, and you can see that's what it looks like. We could take something like this, and, work it nicer than this. But here's the thing. We could save this out. Let's say like as a TIFF file, desktop. We could just call this height for now. So this gets even more fun potentially in Blender, because you could take these and make these really nice high poly sculpts. You can take approximation and combine them together. And what ends up happening though is on this mesh, it's really dense. So we can actually use a displacement modifier. So we can do like displace. We want to make sure we set this up correctly. Right now, texture coordinates are set to local. Use the UV. We can create new texture. We can go down here. This is our new texture that we just created. We can open, go to the desktop. There's our height TIFF. There we go. It's going to do this number real quick. Here's the trick with this one. We can turn the strength down. It's going to help it out tremendously, but we only want to work with it going, not on the normal, but on Z up. Boom. And there you go. So now we can actually add this to it and start to make things like this also happen. It's very low res right now, so you're not going to see much detail in it. But if I was to subdivide it up, all right, and it probably would help if I went higher, but for the video, I'm not going to do that. But the main idea is that we can start to use something like that to also just make this look a little bit nicer without really trying too much, like we don't have to do too much extra work. Shade smooth, and go back to sculpt mode. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to look real well because the texture there that we created, it's backwards first of all, but the approximated height map mixed with our sculpt could look really nice. It's not going to be super nice in our case because I didn't line them all up. That's where you would want to make a seamless texture first and then bring that in perhaps. And also, you got to pay attention to this because this does happen sometimes where we'll just turn it off for a second and we'll do a little bit of sculpting. But certain tools while you're sculpting will make these things shift around, right? And it'll go in X and Y directions, even though we locked it. So certain tools like snake hook, grab tool, things like that might do that. And you got to be careful with that. So you're wanting to try to just use your bare minimum sculpting tools here, like scraper, perhaps, clay strips, draw sharp, maybe things like that. If you start to have these overlap each other, it won't bake correctly, right? That's the main thing. So, but this would be your high poly, and you would bake it to a low poly that matches. So you're looking at creating a low poly plane, basically, and you can bake this to it, right? And it also has to be repeated. You used to not have to repeat the low poly, and it baked okay in substance, but as of late, it's been having issues, I guess. So I've been making the low poly tile as well, and you have to offset the UVs. That's the big part of that. You have to offset things. So this is going to be very rough, but I think you get the idea. Like we can start doing things like this. We can have a lot of fun, and we can go and use like the scrape tool. We can work this back down. All right. This is all has to do with tiling. So like this is just like processing of like rock material, perhaps, or maybe other kind of materials you create. Maybe you do some hand sculpting, mixing with height maps, and just whatever you got to do, right? Like to make your assets. But this will in fact sculpt seamlessly. It's just a little bit hard to tell right now. And we're just going to try to finish doing some of this rather fast. It's not going to be real great. Okay. You can see that one went a little bit too large there, maybe. So our seams are right up here. And if we go over it, what we'll see on the other side is it continues, right? A little hard to tell sometimes. So your material, if you're really struggling with that, you can add a color, mix color, throw it in there. And you can just blend with like the white if you want, or if you want to try something else, you could, right? So you can lighten the texture a little bit, basically. So now you can see how ridiculous this is looking, but you get the idea. Let's just go ahead and just add some generic bump kind of stuff going on here, and we'll flatten it down with a scraper a little bit. And we'll move on over to baking this. We'll do a couple bake examples, but I don't want to get too involved with it. So we'll do this one, and then we'll do maybe like a cylinder or something. I don't know. Or we'll do more like a trim sheet, like laying out a trim sheet manually. Because doing high poly trim sheets, it's the same idea as doing this, right? What we're doing right now. Same with doing atlasing, because we already know how to lay out the geometry. So it's basically the same things. But we'll just try to lay this out, make it more interesting. Don't forget to work into the negative as well. It can be quite useful. There's lots of little rocks in here, which makes this take even longer. It's not like a bunch of big surfaces. But you get the idea, right? It's going to sculpt seamlessly. Did it change? No, it did not. Okay. Yeah, it should be okay down there. It's a big image. Okay. Well, it's like not a big image, but it's like a lot of detail in this image. So not always the best to have materials that do that, but sometimes it's useful. I'll have to play it by ear, and yeah, you can see we're working it really up close to it too. Those can be pushed in, so we hold control, do that. I'm using a graphics tablet, by the way, if you're just curious. It does speed this kind of stuff up because you can turn on pressure sensitive radius and also put that to work a little bit as well. And just very lightly push on things, basically. If you turn the strength up, it is more pronounced that way. So you can like lift corners and then just scrape them back, or use like draw sharp and stuff like that, right? Or even the plateau tool here is just kind of a new one. Plateau here that just flattens surfaces based on normals. So this is really good to create like little angled pieces here, right? So you could do things like that perhaps, or the scraper. You can set that one to normal too, or scraper. Did they change it? I think they might have changed it a little bit. Yeah, it looks like they changed it. I'll have to look into that one. Okay. So used to be able to change that one anyways. But yeah, we'll just scrape them down. Learned something new in my own video, right? That's a good thing. I'll just scrape some of these down. They're way too tall. They're very unrealistic. I'll put it that way. You can also go into edit mode, by the way, because this is just geometry after all. If you want to just flatten everything or like reduce the range there, you can press S and Z. You can do something like that. In edit mode, that way you don't do the scale here. When you're sculpting, the scale matters. So you don't want to have non-uniform scale. If you see it complaining, press Control A, apply scale. That'll give you, or like Alt S, and you'll give ones, and that's better for sculpting. Now this displacement can be turned back on. You can see we get a nice little combination of the two, perhaps. Probably better to do less is more, and that's the main thing though, right? So let's just go and move forward. We'll do cliff. We'll just call it cliff, and this one will be underscore high. Okay, cliff underscore high, and this is going to be lowercase high for substance, okay? You shade it smooth. The material on it really does not matter to me at this point. Like, it's not going to do anything for me. But I just want to bake the normal map out so you get an idea, okay? And so we're going to create a plane underneath this. We'll turn the high off for a second. This plane here, once again, we're going to have to do this because otherwise we get these weird artifacts now in Substance, which we used to not, but maybe we always did and I just didn't notice it. But anyways, so we have to do this all doubled up like this, but it gets a little bit more interesting than this. So first, these UVs need to be overlapping, okay? And they are right now by default because they're all in the same area. So there's tons and tons of UV stuff in here, which is great. But all of them but the middle one, we want to offset. So these ones here. So we can select all of these faces, grab all of these UVs, press G, X, and 2. We offset like that, okay? We haven't even joined these objects together. And honestly, you're going to get in this weird like battle with joining things together, making mistakes, and have to redo things. It's just what's going to happen. But so be prepared to go in and out of Substance Painter and model things and rearrange them and do all kinds of nonsense. But we're going to join them to the middle one real quick. So the origin point's in the center. It lines up with our high poly. We're all good here. Now, so we have everything offset except for that middle one, right? This is the only one that's not. Good. Okay. So this is now cliff underscore low. And there we go. All right. So we got 2 of them. You can see how much bigger this one is. It doesn't really matter because it's low poly. This one we had to cut so that it wouldn't be as bad. All right. For the face count. So we're going to export this one. Let's just, before we do that, let's just copy the name. Export FBX. We're going to export only the selected object, desktop, and cliff underscore high for now. Copy this one. Make sure we select the object, and we export only selected object, cliff underscore low. It would be maybe a good idea to name this offset. Okay. Just like that, we're done. Now let's go over to Substance Painter. We'll get out of Designer while we're at it. And then once we get over there, we'll just load it up, bake it, just so you can see that this actually works in this manner. This is what you have to do for these types of objects, okay? It's not that it's fun, but it's what you have to do. Because it's goofy sometimes, right? You got to merge all your vertices on the low, all right? New. And you have to offset it too. We'll just use that PBR metallic roughness, compute tangent space, DirectX 1024. Select object, we're going to do the low offset. Nothing else is checked, I think, so we'll click OK. It might be using aces. No, it's not. I'm in the, oops. Press, in my case, F2. We got this, okay. We're going to bake. And we're going to load up the high poly. And we're going to let it do its thing. And you can see it's going to bake right there in the center, okay. And so we can also change like max frontal distance, rear distance, or whatever as needed. We're just going to bake default settings here. You can spice them up later on by adding anti-aliasing and all that other fun stuff. It'll take longer to bake. We return to paint mode after baking. You can see, in fact, we have made this happen like so, but we do have some apparently ray misses. This is going to be the back direction because we went down, right? So bake settings, max rear distance. We can also increase that perhaps. Let's check underneath real quick. Let's see if we got any kind of things just not going on right here. Okay, let's bake it again. Let's see if that looks better now. You can turn this on and off in the bake screen, so if you messed up. But yeah, you can see it looks better. Okay? So we can return to painting mode. And now we can go to like a smart material and maybe make our own smart materials or whatever the case. Find something that might work for this, like Cliff Rock or whatever the case, right? I don't even know if they got one by default for that. Now that I think about it, I don't think they do they? Hmm. Okay, yeah, maybe they don't. Ground nature. Let's do that. Very very glossy, apparently. I didn't know it was gonna be that glossy. Mud, that's why. So what else we got in here? Stylized nature. Let's do that. Okay. Close enough. It's not a rock, but you get the idea. Um, it successfully bakes out. If we press B, we can look at our baked mesh maps. There's an ID, ambient occlusion, curvature, so on and so forth, right? So very possible. You want to put some time into it, make sure it happens. Press M to go back to material. Now, um, have fun with it. It's a lot of fun. If we did like a fill layer, and just to give you an idea here as well, and we want to bring in a base color texture. So let me go to my texture packs real quick. We will do textures.com. Cliff. This won't line up to it anymore, I don't think, but we'll try anyways. We'll see what happens. Or rock was it? Yeah. And it was, I think this one. So I'm just going to drag this and drop it into base color real quick. See what happens. There you go. Okay. Let's change. We don't need all of these necessarily. We don't need height, normal necessarily. Opacity, emissives, metals. We just need roughness. Maybe we crank the roughness up a bit. All right. Looks very flat. That's to be expected. And remember, we sculpted on this. It wasn't seamless. So you can actually bring in a PBR material and just assign it appropriately to all the different channels there if you wanted to without baking it. You can actually use the clone stamp tool after with the paintbrush. I've shown this in previous video where you just you can use the clone stamp tool with the paint layer. All you have to do is clone stamp, okay? And you have to change all of these. There's a way to do all of them at the same time now. I just got to look it up. I forgot what it was. But base color, we're going to do pass-throughs, okay? Height, pass-through. Roughness, pass-through, okay? Metallic, pass-through. Normal, pass-through. Opacity, pass-through. And emissive, pass-through. If you want to do all of them, that's what you do, okay? And so we can hit V, click somewhere. We can use a clone stamp tool just like we did in Blender or Krita even. And we should be able to work with this. Oh, but we're going to run into an issue here. You see, like I clone stamp it like out here and I start trying to paint, nothing happens. I clone stamp it here and I start painting inside here, it works fine. But if I go over the seam, nothing happens here, okay? So the UV offset, eventually what you have to do, you want to keep it offset, I think, until you got the bake going exactly the way you want it and you know it's good. Because eventually what you have to do is you have to take this low poly here, right? And you have to take all of those faces that were over here. You got to press GX -2, place them back. Don't offset them. Take this low, you re-export this thing out, but without the offset, right? And now when you go back to your project, you go to project configuration, you can select the one without the offset, right? And then just click OK. It should still be fun. Now, the trick about this, though, is now that we've done that, we can go over the edges, right? So we can mix this up with an alpha that's grungy. Find a good one that works for you at least. I don't know if this one's going to work for me, but we'll try it anyways. You can change your settings of your brushes and use them a little bit more aggressively as like stamps, perhaps. So you can use like a mouse and not a tablet. Just click in here, hold control, rotate it, change the sizes, use small ones as well. Patch it all up basically. So we could actually make this match for the most part. It's something we could do. Not really a big deal. So if we just want to maybe come through here and try to get this going at least. You can see where doing this beforehand would have helped a lot because we wouldn't have to do this right now. We'd have a matching height map for it. Then we can actually spice it up with all the other material options inside of Substance here. But we can definitely make it seamless still, which is the main thing. All right. Maybe get rid of some of those shadows. I don't know. Stuff like that, right? You can do this anywhere now too, like over the borders basically, right? All right, yeah, so even if you had a non-tiling texture or material, you could take it in here, do this number, and make it tile. So this is actually how you might process photogrammetry sometimes, because photogrammetry is great for the height map. Not so great for everything else. As far as the PBR material goes, you'd have to analyze your images and make them accordingly or whatever. But anyways, yeah, so we got this going. Remember, in Substance as well, you might have to set up the displacement on it under one of these. You can enable things like parallel exclusion, perhaps, change the strength on that. Not working here in this case, but you can change the scale of a height map and add subdivision and so on and so forth, right? So you can kind of see it with some geometry added back to it. Now, this was rather low res, so it's not going to be too impressive, but I think you get the idea. If it was a higher resolution mesh, we would be able to see that height map on there very easily. And then once again, we can check out single channels, which will just be our bake maps, our mesh maps we already looked at. We have a single channel, so you can hit C, and we can look at our different ones we're actually working on. Emissives, normals plus heights. But yeah, height was there at the front. So our height's really not that impressive anyways, but anyways, you work these until you get the impressive results that you expect, right? That's the main thing. Now, all that's out of the way. We understand this little process. Great. So when we're working on other things, like trim sheets, for example, we'll do trims and cylinders, I guess, at the same time. So if this is our UV space and we're creating a trim sheet, very easy to understand here. We do the same thing. It's just like working with the sculpt, but the only difference is that we want to go over the borders sometimes with the high polys. So this would go all the way over perhaps. Otherwise, there might be times you don't do that. Like, for example, you can leave these blank perhaps, right? Like, we don't need none of these faces down here. But what if we had like a little section in here at the very end that does something like this? So we inset and hold control and all that, right? But now we can see what's going to happen here, right? Eventually we can take these, bevel them. Maybe you use subdivision, maybe you don't. It's up to you. But like if you were to subdivide this, it would look pretty good. You just want to make sure it's not coming off of that seamed area. But this would have, if it was realistically made, it would have ambient occlusion in this little crevice here, right? Your high poly gets repeated as well. So left to right, something like that, right? For a trim sheet. Now, if it's a seamless texture and you're doing something like a bunch of bricks laid together or pebbles or gravel, and you don't want to sculpt all of them, you want to model them instead. So that happens as well. And so we can let's just make the idea of maybe a small little stone or something, right? An egg or something. If this exists here, it's a good idea that we use grid snapping. This makes it easier. We can grid snap to right on the edge with the origin point, and we can place another one over here. They'll match. It'll make them seamless, basically. Okay. So that's really, really important to do. As long as it's like the same here and the same over here, you're good. If you don't have the ability to grid snap it, we have values, right? So like this is going to be y-axis, right? So we can duplicate it, and on the y-axis, we can just put negative. You see what I'm saying? It's going to place it in the exact same spot, basically. Okay. So, well, it should have. It doesn't look like it did, actually. That's interesting. Is this off? No. Yeah, that's not right. That's definitely wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about that, actually. You could do I was going to say you could do a mirror, but honestly, maybe an array. And then on that axis, okay, so it was Y, we do 2 meters. It's using relative. Let's apply rotation, negative 2 meters. Okay, the scale here must be messing something up. You always run into little weird issues every now and then. I'm going to press Control A, apply scale. This will have to be reset, I think. And we'll see how this works out here. Oh, this is relative, not constant. Sorry. That's what's wrong. So we should be able to do negative 2 meters. All right. That would be correct. Why we're having issues with the positioning there, I don't know. Let's duplicate it again and put the location X or location Y, excuse me. Do negative 2M. That could also work potentially. In our case, yeah, it's looking like it worked fine. But why is it now below? That is a good question there. So Shift D, right click, location, negative 2M. Somehow I've entered it in Z, I guess. So yeah, you get the idea. It has to repeat like this. You have to line these things up. This is why I say just use a grid. It's easier, but generally it should work out just fine. I'm not sure exactly why this one was causing so many problems here, but look, if you line it to the grid, even if it's the smaller grid, it's fine, right? Like this is off by like 10, right? 10 centimeters. Boom. So that should in theory be working, but it's going to be like right here off 10 in this direction. So yeah, it's a little confusing sometimes, but it'll get you at some point or another. Simple things like that. Another fun one to deal with is like bricks, because when you think about creating a brick, think of it like this: like maybe we're doing 3 bricks or 3 little concrete sections, right? And you got to make these all perfectly sized, and they all have to fit in the exact same areas, right? Okay, so sometimes you're going to want to grab these things, go into edit mode with them together, and then do individual origins and scale these at the same time as well. So that way you don't have to redo it. Or you can use link duplicates as well. So if like you took one of these and you Alt D it and Alt D it over here, you see where that's going? So now we can do like these link duplicates basically. Something like this. You still, if you need AO in this area, you would do another one there. Okay. But you can create the pattern now. And now you can just repeat the pattern. And you can see how it doesn't snap kind of like where we need it to. So we could just hold Control and Shift and get it to snap roughly where we need to. But sometimes you want to use an active element. So you Shift double tap, make it active. And active element will be the origin point it uses now. So you can also do that. In our case, it's still not going to work, but it's better than it was perhaps, right? If you had Shift D these by accident, what ends up happening is that, let's see if we can get rid of this selection here. This is going to be challenging, right? Let's grab these ones. Okay. S and Z it. We'll apply scale. Control A, apply scale. You can see it's a multi-user. It complains and it causes all kinds of problems. We convert to mesh and then apply scale. Yep, it should have made them unique, but it didn't. Let's do. There's a lot of little weird things in Blender like this that happen sometimes, but make single user object and data should also work. So now these should not be linked together or anything like that. So, but we should be able to press Control A and apply scale now too, which is Blender needs to think about fixing things like that, I think. But anyways, we got it together. We're good. But they're all unique, right? And so we want them all to be the same as this exact one here, perhaps, right? So we Control L, link object data, boom, and now they're all linked duplicates, basically. So if we were to take something like this, and for whatever reason we wanted to sculpt on it, we can go to sculpt mode, hit R, okay, and Control R, and there we go. And as long as we're sculpting on something that we know is already tiling, it should, for the most part, be okay. And because this one will be over here, basically, right? So when we are in a, we sculpt on it, Alt Q to it, and R, Control R, there we go, bring it up a bit. Okay, and we can use whatever tools we want. Let's just use a scraper real quick. Okay, and you can start doing numbers like this, but you probably don't want to have any open spaces in the background usually. A lot of times, unless there's like a grout texture thing that you're trying to expose that you've also maybe sculpted or you have a plane for at least, you don't want to have like empty space where you haven't thought about how it's going to bake down. But anyways, yeah, you can create the idea of texture a little bit, perhaps, but it's usually about like the primary form and the primary kind of form of the object, and then like secondary shape. So primary shape, secondary shape. So what I'm trying to say, but also once again, these things it also might help you to or benefit you a little bit to sometimes lock X and Y, because if you get like weird overlaps going, like let's just use the elastic grab. We'll see how this works. Actually, let's use just a regular grab tool. If they peel over like this, it's not the end of the world. You could possibly like touch that up in Substance or something or Photoshop. It'll just bake weird, right? It won't look good. So a lot of times you want to work just up and down as well, but not always. Sometimes it's impossible to do that on certain things, and you'll have to touch it up later, anyways. So yeah, if they're like bricks or wood planks or whatever the case, you get the idea. Like you don't have to overdo these things a lot of times. You can let Substance do a lot of the heavy carrying of the material. You just want to make sure they're nice and sharp and they look good here in Blender. And Substance will bake quite heavy polygon counts, and so will Marmoset. So if you ever find yourself in a really bad situation where you absolutely need to reduce these some, if you have a lot of curves, they're not going to reduce very well. But if they're very flat surfaces, possibly like this one, let's say I just had a bunch of geo going and I applied this one, right? You see where that's going? Like we could maybe do something like decimate, set it to planar, type in 0.05. And it's just going to get rid of flat surfaces. In our case, it's still too rounded apparently, but it would work out the flat surfaces very efficiently and effectively. So, okay, it's not this one. But yeah, anyways, so once again, this is the same process, right? Exact same process here that we were doing before with the sculpt, but now it's just set up like this. All right. And I'm pretty sure that if I took this here, all of this, and sometimes you need a backdrop still. So you create another plane perhaps, right? So we got this, the plane in the background. We got all of these now. If you have ingons, you need to triangulate this mesh. You make sure it shades properly because this is a high poly, right? You can use ngons, booleans. You can use sub. It doesn't really matter. But we get all of this going. We got all of it selected. You see the plane there in the background. I'm going to just go ahead and convert it to a mesh, join it together. This one we're going to call cliff underscore, you guessed it, I. And we should be okay on this one where we can just bake this one out. But let's go back to Painter. So we already had done some stuff here. Let's get rid of all that for a second. And for the bake, let's bring this in as the high. Okay, should reload it. And we should be able to bake it, and it should be there. Whoop, no, it is not there. Oh, you know why it's not there? This is in a different position than the original. Let me import FBX. Let's do the cliff low. Okay, no, it's in this. It's in the center. Okay. So what do we got going on here? Did I not export this? Maybe I didn't. Selected objects only. Or I exported it to the wrong folder. That tends to happen sometimes. So export it here. Back to Painter we go. Bake. Should load it up. You should be able to see it even. That might be part of the problem. Make sure it's all out far enough in both directions. Bake it. Looks like it still didn't bake it right, huh? Yeah, it did not, huh? Okay. Now this could be part of the problem that I was expecting, but it's, remember our project configuration, we changed it to the non-offset cliff low, right? And we need the offset one. So I'm thinking that might have been part of the problem, and it was. So just verifying that this is the issue that you run into, okay? You have to offset. But blam, just like that, we have material. So if we're doing trims for buildings and stuff like this is possibly the method you might go through. Obviously, we have no detail here in the background sections, so we'd want to work with those perhaps. We can do that even in Substance. You can do like height blends and all kinds of other fun stuff. So This isn't about texturing here in this one, but it is just trying to get you open to this idea of creating trim sheets, tiling, materials, textures. And so even though we did this on 0 to 1 space, you can do this in atlases. So you can make whole collections of objects, set up their UVs appropriately in the atlas, and then tile the model, right? So this doesn't happen or take place just in the middle of the scene, perhaps. Like if you had another object you wanted to toss into this, right? And you wanted to set it up so that this is tiling, that UV map would go along with these ones. And it can be baked high to low, but you have to offset it. Okay. And so just like we did with the cylinder there, texture painting it and all that, just like the plane in the background, offset for baking, move them back when you're texturing. Okay. Easiest way to do that. As long as your models line up with each other and kind of like left and right, up and down, or whatever the case, right? Like you just make them appropriately, they will be able to tile. Okay. But you have to do it usually by 3 in the case of the plane, or like in the case of a trim, you can just do 3, right? Up and down, like so x-axis 3, up and down 3, but you want to fill the corners as well. So you end up with 9, right? When you have objects that are unique to themselves, right? You just do the repetition of 3. If it wraps, all that fun stuff. Confusing, I know. And then so how do you work this out ultimately at the end of the day, right? Like when do you do what and where and how and why and all that other fun stuff? Look, whenever you see anything repeating in an image when you're pre-planning, whenever it's repeating, this is your dead giveaway that you can do things like this, okay? It's not saying that you will do this, but it's your dead giveaway that you could do it. So like these little pieces here, like we could texture that whole thing as one texture, but it might be a very large piece, right? So we might just texture a part of it and then repeat that texture 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever amount of times down as a trim, right? Or as a tile. Okay, it's the same idea there. Maybe we create one of these that are real generic, and it's there's no real unique texture to it for the most part. And then later on, we create a material that goes with it, or a decal or something that can cover, start to create this variation. Or maybe we do like vertex blending, all the fun shader stuff that you can get into, right? You can create a trim here that just runs across all of these that look very similar anyways. How you start breaking up the repetitiveness is where you're going to start using material blends. Might do multiple tiles perhaps. So you might have not just do one of those, but like 3. And then when you get another 3 of these made, you can start mix and matching them next to each other and rotating them upside down perhaps, and reversing the UVs and things like that. So there's all kinds of cool little tricks like that you can do. But it starts kind of at this pre-planning stage. You're looking to figure out like what you can do. And you don't always have to go super granular with it. I mean, sometimes it doesn't pay off to do that. Like you could try doing like whole sections of areas. Like this could be maybe a whole thing right here, right? All of this might be like its own thing, but you wouldn't necessarily have to create all of these, right? And even if you did one like this, maybe create 3 like this, and then you can mix and match them together, perhaps. But other things might be details. So, maybe the yellow's like the big 0 to 1 bakes. Maybe you can do like seamless textures and then material blend these together. So you get all kinds of variations in the background. You see what I'm saying? And then we make, maybe these are the trims, right? Like all the trims we need to create in these areas. So you can determine how many trims you're going to create. 3, 1, more, who knows? Maybe UV map all that unique even. And then because it's all kind of squared up, you can usually break them down really tight. But ultimately, that's going to be a lot more vertices for that UV, perhaps. Who knows? Maybe you don't want to do that. Even if you're doing trims, it's going to get kind of crazy. But yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. Like, you got to start pre-planning what you're doing and where, and what's a detail, what's a trim, what's a primary shape, secondary shape, tertiary shape, all that fun stuff. And so, but before you know it, this is really easy because you can create all kinds of different just stuff very quickly in all kinds of different areas. That doesn't show up very good with overlay, does it? Do multiply then. So, if you want to make a little trim or tileable material of this, leave it kind of generic and repeat it, then good. And then later on you add decals to it that add grunge and stuff, right? Or do a material blend to add grunge, all that, right? It takes time to get used to doing this because you're going to look at your references a lot of times and it's just going to be overwhelming because there's so much detail in a lot of things, right? Like how do you even begin to plan something like this out? This is where I'm going to highly recommend going into something like Unreal Engine, downloading assets that are available for free on the marketplace, or even get a paid asset if you want, if something really piques your interest, and study it. Study what that artist has done with the shaders, perhaps. Doesn't mean it's always going to be right. It's better to have multiple assets to look at, right? Because a lot of people, they make things as kind of like little architectural visualizations or just like tech demos. They're not really optimized necessarily for games right off the bat. Like it could just be like somebody's portfolio piece they decided to put up for sale and it's just not fully optimized. So a lot of things can be wrong on marketplaces, but generally speaking, you should be able to start looking at it and determining like, what are your basic materials that you're thinking about creating and how you might be using them. Seamless textures, trim sheets, atlases, and are they tileable on the atlas or the trim? Because remember, trims are usually seamless X to Y, but if you make it seamless, or excuse me, seamless from on the X-axis, but if it's seamless on the Y-axis too, even though it's still the size of a trim sheet, you can make it tileable, right? So people do that a lot of times for like rugs and carpets and floor tiles and stuff like that. So when you're creating like really intricate stuff, you can do that. You can double up your trims basically to make them a little bit larger and whatnot. So, but yeah, you can just start looking at these things, start planning them out in your head, like what's a detail, what's a trim, or what could be a trim, and so on and so forth. Like windows, a lot of times you can get away with doing the frames here in full. Sometimes you can do material blending on stuff like this. I mean, it's just really up to you ultimately. A lot of you are probably going to work on portfolio pieces. And so you can do a mix of it, try out different ideas. You don't have to always rush through it. As for the shader setups themselves to take advantage of everything, as far as create materials go, there's only like so many shaders you really need to know about. First is like setting up decal shaders, right? Like mesh decals, setting up projected decals perhaps. But you're going to want to know how to do like possibly tessellation or displacement, right? Kind of the same idea there. Tessellation is just dynamic tessellation is just a nice thing to have. But so pushing things out with height maps, displacement, tessellation, one of those shaders is going to help you out quite a bit. Faking different kinds of bump mapping, so using normal maps or OBM maps or whatever they call them, I guess. But the ways you control blending with either vertex colors or using mask, RGB mask, packing, roughness, metallic maps, all that fun stuff could be useful. Parallax occlusion maps, obviously. There's like parallax occlusion for interiors when you're doing buildings. There's parallax occlusion for the ground, right? There's different ones you could potentially use there. Super useful. It could also be helpful to play around with. I mean, I'm just talking about environment art in general. If you're trying to learn this, not just working with tileables, right? But if you're going to try to create like UI elements, tileables are useful there as well. You could possibly use that in UI pieces, perhaps. Where else can we go with this? Characters can have tileables on them as well. That's possible for like strings or ropes and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it just goes like whenever you can use it, you should use it, right? If you can. Otherwise, you run out of VRAM, you overload the textures, and nobody can play it anyway. So less is often more as well. So even though because you can do like a blend, even though you like could do trims everywhere, sometimes trying to simplify things as much as possible is the better way to go. So like if you make a very bare bones basic wall, you throw some rusty decals all over your environment, posters, and then detailed meshes, greebles, things like that, covering up all the nonsense. Sometimes that works out really well as well. For a wall like this, you're looking at material blends for the most part. And you might do some detail baking as well with some stuff in here for like the windows, the bars, these little pillar pieces, perhaps. Maybe even some of the floor section, the concrete foundation or whatever that is. And so yeah, you got to start breaking these things down. This could be like two materials, maybe, or two materials, but like one's going to be a material blend, so it's like three materials, right? This one, you could probably do all this with trims. I don't see any reason that you shouldn't be able to. And then maybe bake some detailed meshes into the trim as well. Things like that. You could also use material blending on some of this, perhaps if like this metal, for example, is used a lot in other parts of the environment, if that's what you're creating. So same with like the top one. This might be a seamless texture, not necessarily an atlas with tiling texture, right? But other ones like this is, you can pack this all into, maybe use a seamless texture in the background, but all the windows you just pack into a detailed texture. You can make them with trims, not with trims, up to you. Um, the shader, the windows would have probably their own shader with parallax occlusion. This tends to be the going thing these days with fake environments, interiors, and stuff. That's a whole nother ballpark of a project. So otherwise, you can just create basically like the idea of the interior in the texture, right? Like you can fake it basically. And you would have multiple textures possibly for window sections. Might be a new material though, so like 3, something like that perhaps. You can always increase those in some areas. You can increase the amount of materials you use. It's not uncommon to see assets that have like 6 or 8 materials. Usually you want to make sure those are on other assets though as well. But the reason this works is because by default, Unreal Engine does material instancing and our GPU instancing and batching by default, right? So you don't have to turn it on. It's not like Unity. You got to set it all up in Unity, make sure it's working. Unreal, it's already on. It should be working. So when you have instances of things, you'll have more performance. But when objects have the same materials, it's useful because what's going to happen is that's part of like batching. Every face that has a certain material will be pushed to the GPU at the same time. Okay. And so it's going to be one draw for that, right? And then every other material will be another draw, right? So, but it pushes it as like one big batch of data or static mesh, if you would, of all the faces that have that material. So that's why it performs better to do that. And it's okay to sometimes have more slots. Not entirely. You don't want to go too crazy with it, but sometimes you can still have them all batched together. Batching has performance limits as well. So what ends up happening is if you start batching too many things together, it starts to degrade performance. Right. So you have to still be careful with how you're doing things and try not to overdo your environment. Just keep them somewhat simple and clean, like the base architectural, structural elements. And then you can use details to kind of fill in the area and use instances of details to hide all the repetition. It's kind of the going thing these days, right? Like it's usually the way things have been working out. Um, and doing a lot of material blending can help quite a bit as well with like little fancy shader tricks with like adding paint on top of bricks or plaster or stucco or like layering things up with the shader itself. And so you would end up with the ability to do that. That's a little bit more expensive, but it allows for a lot of variation. And then so you don't end up using maybe as many textures. You see what I'm saying? Round and round it goes. I mean, like just watch videos on guys creating environment pieces. I don't care what engine it's in. You watch how they kind of do it. It's going to be similar with all the game engines, relatively speaking. It's very similar. There's different spec games, low spec, high spec. Depending on which one you're targeting, it's going to determine whether you're doing certain things or not, like material blending. If you're working for low spec, you're probably not going to do a lot of material blending, or it might be very simple material blending. It like vertex coloring as well. But the more high spec stuff, the more stuff you can get away with because GPUs have more VRAM, blah blah, so forth. So your project determines like what your end goal there is, like what you're trying to create. Is it photorealistic, next gen stuff, or is it like mobile friendly stuff? That's going to determine how you go about creating your assets, and the discrepancy or like the difference between your assets from low spec to high spec is huge. I cannot emphasize that enough. Like the way you do things, like low spec is going to be very performant. Usually doesn't look as good, but it can still look very nice. But it's just that it's going to be more performant, and the high spec stuff is just going to be less performant, but look much nicer, generally speaking. And somewhere in the middle there, you have all like standard workflows. You have like VR assets. VR assets are actually surprisingly difficult to create to look well enough because it's just the way draw calls and everything plays out. But and plus, like the stereoscopic vision makes it even tougher, right? So normal maps look like crap in VR. Basically, that's the easiest way to put it. But um, the models themselves carry everything. So this idea of nanite, as everybody's kind of doesn't like the idea of nanite being expensive and lumen and all that. Um, it's definitely, I wouldn't say the most performant type of design choice right now for a game, but in the future, I think it's going to be the better design choice ultimately because it does help with a lot of little various issues like the detail in a VR model, perhaps, right? It's saves a lot of time on LODs, level of detail models, and things like that. And so you do have to think about creating LOD models too. So whenever you're creating uh, environment assets, when you bake them high to low, it's okay. But let me kind of talk about this. I guess I skipped this. I probably should have talked about it. What we've been doing here is baking high to low, right? To a plane. It's a really low model. If you're baking these to other low models, right, and it's like UV mapped in this area, it's kind of the same process. But you have to be careful with sharps, right? And your shading. A lot of times it's better to do like a mid poly low and bake to that as opposed to using sharp edges or using like smooth shading. Some people like to just kick on smooth shading and let it rock, but um, those mid poly models tend to work out better. So you can bake like high poly to a mid poly, and then if you want to reduce it after, maybe you could, and then do a level of detail model. But if you start trying to use sharps on all of it for like a little section that's got a high to low poly bake, that'd be fine. But using sharps on like trims, I wouldn't highly recommend that. I don't think it works out too well. You're better off baking those to low polys and doing it that way. And then you can just take the low poly and like you can make another model and map it to the low poly because then you're going to have to use possibly, not always, but possibly certain types of chamfers or bevels. You might have to use custom normals where you start pointing your object's normals back out the way it would supposed to be displayed with the normal map there. Like we're looking down at it. So your low poly model would have all the normals pointing like it's looking back up basically. It's a tricky subject. There's a lot we can, keep talking about because like just talking about this like in an academic kind of way, like just the idea of the tools you might use, the process of just doing the actual tiling is one thing. Putting it to work with lots of assets and figuring out how to break down your assets, do the whole environment is going to be a lot more challenging. If you're trying to do environment art, you have to practice this. It's not going to come naturally to you until you start doing it more and more. You'll start to say like, oh, I need like the structural elements of this building first, like the big walls, ceiling, floors, things like that. And then you'll start thinking about like all the details, the trims, and all that other fun stuff you can do with it, like material blending and how you'll start lighting things like that as well. Cause it's actually very challenging sometimes to even get lighting going correctly. So, and then you got to mix it with terrain, streets, roadways, sidewalks, curbs, all that fun stuff. So, and then you want to make like a whole city and you want to make it modular mostly, then you got a whole nother animal to start tackling. Right. And so, keeping things simple, always the best way to go. Try not to overdo things. Highly recommend checking out the Matrix demo, tech demo for Unreal Engine. If you can download that, check it out. Look at the buildings in that one. Very proper kind of, well, I'm not going to say the Matrix demo is the most performant thing in the editor, but the assets are made mostly proper compared to most of the assets you'd find on the Unreal marketplace, right? So they were made by Decagon, and they're just good references in general. There's a lot of assets you can use as reference, different packs, things like that. And yeah, so try to follow that lead there. Don't get too overwhelmed by this. You can kind of just look at how they're using shaders, how they're blending, how they're setting up their environments. And if you keep it simpler, if it's not right at first, don't worry about it. Like you can change things later and fix it up, right? The biggest thing with modular pieces, of course, though, is being the origin point, and you don't want to like have accidental wrong sizes and scales and rotations when you import to Unreal Engine. So that way, if you ever update something, it stays updated and it updates correctly, right? So that way you can repair things, change things, fix things. And as far as this goes, though, this is just texture, right? So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Do you do textures force? Do you do textures first, or do you do the models first, right? And this is going to get into sometimes it's easier to start with models like blockouts, detailed blockouts, and then figure out what you need for your environment and the different scales and sizes if they're going to work for that environment. If you've built a number of assets or number of levels or maps already, there's a good odd chance you can just go straight for like the typical structural sizes of things. Usually work out okay, but it's going to be something you got to kind of play by ear sometimes. Like if you make a prop off a photograph, you can scale it to size and be correct, when it's done, right? If you wanted to do it that way. If you want to just block something out real quick to about the right size, you've established a footprint. If you try to scale it later on, it might not work later. So you might want to get the size correct first with the volume, establish that footprint correctly, then detail it later. Or you can just do the detailed model, bring it in and use it where you need it, I guess. But so everything works forward and backwards. Just like when you're creating models, you can start with low polys, turn them into high polys. You start with high polys, do a low poly model around it. You can start at a mid poly, go out in both directions, high poly and low poly, and make both. So, I mean, when you start an environment, do you start with the terrain or the buildings, right? Like these are the things you're going to have to learn by doing, right? Like what do you feel more comfortable with? A lot of times, like myself, I like working with the terrain first and setting up the floors, the foundations of the buildings, perhaps the city aspects, the streets, the sidewalks, and then moving on to the buildings. And then I like to block out the whole building as a big mess. And then I'll start to break it into like little wall chunks and sections and things like that. But that's not to say you have to do that. You could create like a set of wall chunks and sections and then build out whole buildings with it, right? I find that doing it the latter there, it ends up being too repetitious a lot of times, and it feels stiff. It doesn't feel like a very natural, realistic building. So blocking them out first, and then at least trying to work assets into that, and then updating those as I go along, and then texturing them with trims or seamless or whatever the case. I find it to be a really good workflow. And that's why a lot of people use that workflow anyways at studios and whatnot. Because you could do like a pretty rough block out basically on some terrain, play around on it, try out the door sizes and stuff like that. But you can also just grab screenshots. You can do a paint over. You can do a concept piece real quick to see how you want it to ultimately look later on. Just do a quick paint over on it. And then you'll have a better guidance on like what kind of textures you need to create or materials. And so it's an iterative process. It's not like you start it and just work all the way through and you're done. You're going to start it, make something, get it kind of going. It's probably going to be rough or wrong. Then you make something else, might be a little bit rough or wrong. And then, you start polishing them up little by little, one by one as you go through the project. Like if you can make something start to finish and it's going to be great, then do that, right? That's going to set the benchmark for all the other assets in the scene. And then as you work through your project, you can start elevating the quality level to like that highest quality level that you've generated, right? And if you're making 3D models or assets or whatever the case, and the quality level just isn't there, it doesn't look like that AAA kind of look that you're going for, keep pushing, right? It's very easy to give up early on in the ugly duck stage of your assets. Keep pushing. It's going to take you to that higher level where you can just like really start making things just look phenomenally well. I know lots of talking here at the end of the video, but this isn't like the most challenging thing to do. It's like part of the texturing material creation process, basically. So if you can understand this faster and understand like making seamless, tileable materials, right? You're better off for it. Because now you got to start thinking about how you construct your atlases and trim sheets, make them modular, perhaps in a sense that you can have multiple walls or multiple structural elements or props in the game or whatever. Like if you took one trim sheet setup and it was like wood, and then you took another trim sheet setup, it's all like sci-fi materials or whatever, metals and stuff, and you had some kind of asset modeled already. Like if you threw a wood material on it, would it look like it's in the Old West? If you swapped it with a sci-fi one, would it look like, it's in, I don't know, cyberpunk or something? But you get the idea. Like just changing textures and materials on objects can be super useful to establish like the genre of the game, or like the textures play a huge role. It's not always just about like the model, but you can change and create variations of things with just texture swaps, which is really cool. So anyways, yeah, a lot of talking. All right. So hope you enjoyed this one. I'll check you guys out next one. All right. Take care.